Revealed ex-teacher hawks white nationalist homeschool lessons. Racism and hatred is taught. It is not something that children are born doing. They learn it, and they have been taught to hate. And how they're taught to hate? By adults who hate. Mark Hay, Monday, December 27th. This is the reason why they do not want critical race theory in schools. This article pretty much explains in detail why homeschooling is why most of these private homeschools operate. It goes into depth about why critical race theory to these particular groups they feel is harmful. So the School of the West is what they call themselves, a recently launched online educational resource for homeschooling parents, offers a smattering of materials, anywhere from free materials or materials that are for paying members. It's to help teach kids the standard subjects of math, science, and language and arts. But its key selling point is a unique and deeply disturbing field of study that the site has dubbed the white wellbeing. It is a write-up on the contents of an upcoming 3-month live stream white wellbeing course, advised for students ages 4 years old and older. It explains that it will help children understand the gift of being born in the members of the Westernkind and the qualities that separate us from the other races. So, in case it wasn't clear, the write-up later clarifies that the white race is known as the Westernkind. So it also promises to teach them how to spot and respond to anti-white propaganda. So that supposedly suffuses modern life, why white people are the only true citizens of Western nations, and how feminism has destroyed the family unit and supposed backbone of the Westernkind, thus weakening our societies. This blatant white nationalist ideology is infused into some of the site's lessons on conventional subjects as well. So its history materials, for example, falsely teach that the notion of European colonization is led to the spread of new disease that decimated indigenous populations is not established historical fact, but an anti-white myth. And so the school also links to the Institute of Historical Review as a reliable online source for the study of history. The IHR notoriously publishes material that push for Holocaust denial and anti-Semitic readings of history using the language and formatting the conventional academia, but none of its rigor. And the school's life sciences materials are just a series of 7 videos and attendant worksheets on the supposed science of human racial differences, which deliver a series of thoroughly debunked pseudoscience arguments as if they were hard facts. So as if to underscore its focus on white nationalist indoctrination, one video on the site even tells children that the face of a supposedly virulently anti-white culture. It's important to do your schoolwork, but it's even more important to feel good about yourself and your own people. Oh, and an ad it shows for the site floating around in the dark corners of the internet opens pictures of all white communities and schools in the mid 20th century, then juxtapose them with images of diverse classrooms and clips of black kids hitting white kids, among other racial fear-baiting imagery. Towards the end of the ad, text pop up and read, "Enough, reclaim your destiny." So it then shows a copy of White Fragility, which is a well-known book, and the pop explainer on the systemic and often unconscious racism burning over coals. So it is easy to dismiss the site as a gross but ultimately marginal aberration. After all, it appears to be one guy's pet project. So on the site, he goes by the name as Brant Danger, but the Anti-Defamation League extremism researcher Mark Pitzkevich and the Daily Beast have identified him as Brant Williams, who until this spring was a teacher in the majority Native American Page Unified School District, which serves Page, Arizona, and the surrounding areas. So a representative for the PUSD, told the Daily Beast that Williams left over his own violation at the end of the last school year. So the representative said that they weren't aware of his work on the School of the West. So Williams did not respond to the repeated efforts to reach him for comment on this particular story, but experts on the homeschooling and white nationalists alike say that his school actually reflects long-standing efforts to indoctrinate children into extremism. So it's just far more blatant, visible, and organized than many past extremist homeschooling endeavors. So Amy Cooter, a sociologist who studies white nationalism and grew up in a private Southern Baptist church school with connections to the far-right homeschooling groups, argued that the school's blatant racism is not a naive mistake, but a logical step in larger efforts to bring white nationalist ideas into mainstream consciousness. So our political environment is more receptive to this sort of messaging at the moment, she told the Daily Beast. So notably, in the recent months, fans of the School of the West have started to drop links into a few small social media communities focused on anti-critical race theory activism. So in the hope that people who have bought into twisted partiality, manufactured, and racially charged furor might be amiable to the school and its ideologies. So this tactic probably won't be as successful as the fans of the school that they might hope, but the experts of the Daily Beast spoke to argue. But it may be more successful than many other mainstream observers. And the anti-CRT activists, most of whom vigorously dispute charges that their movement is tinged with racism, would be comfortable with. So I'm sure that some people who have thought of themselves as not racist will buy into this, Cooter told Daily Beast. So motives for homeschooling children in the United States have always been diverse. But for decades, a particularly vocal and visible subset of homeschoolers have advocated pulling their kids out of school to escape supposedly secular and liberal bias of public education. And well known recently, CRT. And so there's also a long-standing connection between homeschooling and anti-integration, white flight, that is. Overt white nationalists in particular started to go all in on the homeschooling in the early 2000s. So Pitkevich noted. So white nationalists are interested in creating their own parallel society, explained Sophia Bjork James, an anthropologist who studies the white nationalist communities. So educating children in white supremacist values is part of this plan. So white nationalists understand that exposing their children to multicultural curricula can lead to a rejection of their beliefs. So however, Jameson's Brewer an education researcher who studies homeschooling tactics and trends, said that the public resources and curricula created for these communities tend to be more shrouded, to use dog whistles. Their textbooks might, for example, frame slavery as a necessary evil or present a both sides narrative about Nazi policies. Cooter added that these sorts of materials also tend to show only images of white families and talk exclusively about white people's histories. And so even curricula that expresses openly far-right ideologies often stop short of talking about things like core racial differences, instead just waxing poetic about loaded concepts like Western Christianity, nationalism, and tradition, while castigating social justice and wokeness and anathema to good, orderly society. And so this is what we've been seeing, and this is the fight that's been happening in most of the schools across the country, is people yelling and shouting about how they don't want certain books they want to ban, or they want to stop CRT, which is critical race theory. They find it, what they say is harmful, but they would rather homeschool their children so they can teach them white nationalist ideology. And Richard Fording, a University of Alabama professor who tracks white nationalist trends, said that there are more explicit white nationalist homeschooling groups out there, but they are normally kind of under the radar, not open to just anyone. So white nationalists also swap ideas about what to teach children on their own niche platforms, so as to help each other develop private idiosyncratic curricula. So in the mid-2000s, a Klan group did create what it called the first homeschooling resources for white nationalist parents, but said it didn't intend to provide all the information, all the tools and books, etc., and instead just wanted to point folks in that particular direction. So similarly, a white nationalist women's group on the West Coast created something that they called a curricula, but that actually just guided those people to purchase it through how to build their own. So experts stress that these efforts have always been small scale, ad hoc, and or fleeting. So they probably haven't been as successful, but this one in particular they're focusing on. So Brant Williams clearly felt there was a major gap in this, in educational offerings to open white nationalists, or for open white nationalists. And so it took it upon himself to fill it in. And so Williams has told a consistent story on a number of far-right live streams and podcasts about how he came to develop the School of the West, is what he calls it. So in these interviews, the School of the West, he consistently goes by the name Brant Danger, and is often cagey about his location, or exact job title. So he doesn't really want to reveal his location, what his work is, and because then that reveals who he is. And this right here, he doesn't feel comfortable revealing his private self, because this is not really something that's a good thing. But the pit cabbage of ADL learned about the School of the West this summer, and he found an old social media handle and email address that used this pseudonym, and were both connected with the name Brant Williams as well. So that's how he was able to put the two together, Brant Williams, Brant Danger. And so both use the same profile and photo, which resemble Brant Danger, who makes no effort to hide or disguise his face during the live streamed interviews or in the School of the West videos as well. So social media account also included a white pride meme and some materials that were related to this teaching. So Williams appears to have slipped up in a few of his Brant Danger interviews as well. So he has somewhat revealed himself. So if he ever was truly attempting to conceal his identity, mentioning that he had taught in Arizona near a reservation, Picavage noticed that and after some searching, found that the name Brant Williams on the faculty page of the Page Unified School District that showed up. And he also found on YouTube videos in which the man who looks like exactly like Brant Danger identifies himself as Brant Williams as well. So a Page, the area Earth and space science teacher that castigates the local school district as well. And so I guess that was before he decided to leave, and he had violated that. Maybe that had something to do with it. But the Daily Beast checked the public records and found that Brant Williams connected to the address in Page. So Arizona Department of Education Teacher Certification Database also lists Brant Williams with an active certificate as well, and so a specialization on earth sciences. And so the Daily Beast couldn't not find any record of any person named Brant Williams. So with a certification to teach in Arizona, living with a 100-mile radius of Page Unified School District representatives also told Daily Beast that Brant Williams taught there until the end of the last school year. And so which lines up with the details Brant Danger has given about his career status and interviews. The representative review and YouTube video of Brant Williams deriding the district as well, and confirmed that the man who appeared in it seemed to be the same Brant Williams who taught in the schools. And so the Daily Beast also identified Arizona Business Incorporation papers, a list of Brant Williams, the owner and operator of a school in West, LLC, which is limited liability company, and so in connection with an address in Page. And so the School of the West websites use an anonymization service to hide its owner from the registration database. So they went through great lengths to try to conceal the identity of who created this thing. But within a trove of database published by hackers who broke into the far-right friendly web hosting service Epic, the Daily Beast found information showing that the site was registered to, once again, Brant Williams, who linked to the post office box in Page. And so the online interviews, in that online interview, Williams speaking as Brant Danger, as he claimed himself, he had a slow racial awakening, is what he says, over the course of his childhood, and he was observed that differences between majority white and majority of communities and schools. But in 2016, he said he started researching Muslim immigration to Europe and online, and went further and further down the rabbit hole. So eventually he found Jason Cohn, an author and streamer, instrumental in the development of seemingly genteel new flavor of white nationalism focused on fostering so-called white well-being in the face of the supposed deluge of anti-white policies and propaganda. So Kono notably advocates the open expression of white cultural pride as a counter to alleged systemic anti-white degradation and oppression. So Williams became the mode in the chants that accompany some of Cohn's live stream, and clearly states that the School of the West materials, that many of his lessons are heavily informed by Cohn's work, or even in some of the cases direct attempts to adapt their arguments for younger audiences. And so Cohn did not respond for the request for comment on this story as well. So Williams has also claimed that the teaching of the majority-minority community deepened his belief in the fundamental differences between differences of races, and so put another way, reinforces racism. That's what it really did for him. So notably, he described the native students as inherently less focused on punctual than his white students, and argued that the reservation communities near Page are covered in trash and full of many dogs, and because Native Americans don't care about cleanliness or animals, bogus and bigoted claims. And so this is what this guy, Brant Williams, or as he calls himself, Brant Danger, had posted. And so he insisted that he loves all of his students and bears no ill will towards other races. So he claims that they are allegedly that they can and should live up according to their supposed inborn and unique racial impulses. But he argued that the diversity and the influence of other cultures is detrimental to the white communities. And so here is a still photo of the classrooms where they start teaching these kids their extremism on white well-being. So high chairs are seen in buildings owned by what is called one of the groups, nationalist groups, the Knights Party. It's a white nationalist group that formally named the Knights of the KKK, which is better known as the Ku Klux Klan, outside of Harrison, Arkansas. And this is in 2018, so that wasn't long ago, as some people like to say. So these groups are very active, even in this day. So he also said that he long chafed at the depictions of multiculturalism in school materials and at the efforts to promote equality or equity within classrooms and wider school systems. At times, he said that when he felt that the school's textbooks were teaching lies, he closed the door to his classroom and teach what he believed was the truth instead. So in one interview, he recounted an instance in which his students asked if something was racist, and he told them not to use that word because the R word for white people is like the N word for black people. And so it's just meant to hurt white people. So don't use that word. Basically, the R word is racism. So the racism is sort of like a negative term for white people. So in his mind. So here's the thing with kids. He recently told another interviewer. And so if I told them that aliens came down and made these people in Hollywood and now everyone in Hollywood is an alien, they'd go, yeah, oh, okay, all right. When you develop trust with students, they'll believe pretty much everything you say. So this is bad when teachers promote anti-white propaganda, he argued, but it's an asset when someone like him comes along to tell them the so-called truth about race and society. So as his urge to spread his blatantly racist gospel to young, impressionable minds and his frustrations with the supposed anti-white bent of his district festered, Williams apparently started talking in the niche social media. So that's when he started putting up his podcasts and platforms in the community about the importance of creating venues for white kids only, who basically allegedly for white kids who want to be taught by whites. So white kids who want to be taught by whites. While he found people online who agreed with him, he couldn't find any resources that he felt fit the bill. And so in the early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic forced the schools to go remote. And so his claim gave him the time to space that he needed to start making his dream a reality. So building the foundation of the School of the West is what they call it, while still teaching in the public school. So he was teaching public school while he was doing this racist platform. That word means something bad in his book to a certain group of people. So registration, although that's what he's doing. Okay, so registration data shows that Williams began to create the school site in April 2020. So it is not entirely clear why he left the school at which he had taught at the end of the last school year, but he claimed that Cone helped him to connect with the other so-called white well-being advocates across the web who had helped him develop his lessons around a dozen white nationalist figures, some obscured and some relatively well-known in the niche of digital scenes that appear to have contributed to this project. So Williams has claimed that he is still working on collaborators to build out the curriculum, which he boasts will grow far more comprehensive in the months and the years to come. So even before he is officially incorporated and launched the school this past summer, far-right streams and social media accounts started to promote and celebrate his venture. And so but the awareness of the project was seemingly confined to the niche white nationalist spheres. So then the right-wing panic over critical race theory had exploded, came onto the scene into the public view. And so the anti-CRT movement is largely alarmist and disingenuous. And so it thrives on misrepresentation of the CRT actually that teaches and of what is actually taught in most schools. So in a way that demonizes discussions about systemic racism and unconscious bias in educational settings, or in some cases, even discussions of American history of racism overall. So, however, even critics in this critical race theory backlash acknowledge that there is a big gap between the freak out and the full-throated white nationalists that the School of the West promotes. And so most anti-CRT figures promote a willful colorblindness, often grounded in decontextualized and sanitized Martin Luther King Jr. quotes that white nationalists find abhorrent. But as Wendy K.Z. Anderson, the expert on CRT, or critical race theory as it's known at the University of Minnesota, noted that in an interview, some anti-CRT activists believe the framework is mainly a mechanism to convey guilt on white children. And so analysis have also suggested that the most fervent CRT debates track to areas experiencing notable demographic change. And so there's a current with the anti-CRT sphere that is anxious about the sensitive to perceived slights against whiteness, okay, above all else. And so white nationalists recognize that current. And so that's why Bjork James argued that ultimately they see that the current focus on CRT theory and opportunity to recruit these new members. So this was the right time to start doing their recruiting of the new members in these white nationalist group with this big blowout of the CRT. So, or as the far right streamers put it, the conversation with Williams a few months back, the anti-CRT movement, I think, is the best place to present our movement. So this is where these groups come in. So the streamer later added that we need to co-opt that movement, and so that they needed to co-opt it. So in recent months, the far-right figures like Candace Owens, Ron Paul, and Stephen Bannon have urged families to consider homeschooling their kids to save their minds from the supposed liberal racial propaganda. So the number of the homeschool students in America has more than doubled since the spring of 2020, but it's not clear how much of that tracks the anti-CRT sentiment. Notably, the fastest growing homeschooling demographics are actually people of color, many of whom opt for homeschooling to avoid systemic racism, which is the other side of the coin. Because people are trying to ban books and take things out of school and water down history, so they might be taking out the real history and doing this whitewashing of history. So people are opting to homeschool because they want their kids to know about their culture and the real history. And so that's the other side of the coin. But the idea that families might heed these calls has seemingly captivated some extremists, pop-in homeschooling curriculum developers who have started to use explicit anti-CRT messaging and advertising to materials and anxious parents. And so hence, the logic and appeal of seeding the School of the West links the anti-CRT social media circles. And so as Fording put it, the school and its advocates are banking on the fact that there are people who are now not embarrassed to embrace the inner white nationalist beliefs and nationalism due to the fact that they're concerned about the so-called anti-white sentiment and policies that have been normalized. And so on the stream of a few weeks back, when asked about the thoughts of the rising anti-CRT fervor, Williams said that you have a population of parents that have finally woken up. And so because of the anti-white material is being propagandized and advertised so loudly now that they can't ignore it. So overall, I think this is a good time, he says. So he suggests that the popular outrage will bring around to his line of thought and to homeschooling. So the Daily Beast also reached out to several prominent anti-CRT groups for comment for the School of the West and its and other white nationalist groups' apparent interest of co-opting them. Only one, Parents Against Critical Race Theory, replied. So their founder, Scott Mineo, said that he and his compatriots do not believe in a race-based or centric education, and no matter the race, and that he had never heard of the School of the West, he claims. So, allegedly. So I'm not here to judge how any family conducts the homeschooling of their kids, he added, but it's not my business no matter the ethnicity. So however, a few anti-CRT advocates appear to have noticed the School of the West links showing up in their communities. One recent movement newsletter specifically called out the school out took pains to instruct fellow activists to not be confused about or seduced by white nationalist rhetoric as well. So Kalal Harris, an expert on the education policy and critical race theory at the left-wing Center of American Progress, doubts that too many anti-CRT types will buy into this appeal of this particular school. So open white nationalist is still beyond the pale, even for many individuals with clear racial anxieties. And so but most of the experts in the Daily Beast spoke to believe that even if the school doesn't draw in a huge number of anti-CRT activists, it could still pull a non-negligible section of the movement into the white nationalist orbit by stoking and affirming the worst race-based fears. And so open bigotry in the School of the West and its potential for radicalizing adults as well as children alike mean that this project might be viewed as by many as a threat to all American society. So as Jim Dwyer, a law professor and author of the History of Homeschooling in the U.S., put it, but there are currently no clear legal injunctions against something like the School of the West. That is the issue right there. So although homeschooling laws vary in some state to state, in most of the country, parents can basically teach their kids whatever they want at home. Think about it. And so let this marinate. So racism is taught back again. So even in the states that require education in certain subjects and ask parents to submit curricula, it's easy to tick all of the right boxes on a form and then just teach whatever you like in practice. And so there's no real follow-up on that. And as long as the parent is covering all the material required and the state is not in position to critique an ideology spin that they may put on it. Okay, so we have no meaningful checks on whether parents are teaching their children stuff that we might think of as bad in fundamental conflict with the values of our society, like white nationalism. Elizabeth Bartholet, a legal scholar, child welfare law expert, and critic of homeschooling norms and regulations, told Daily Beast. So I wouldn't go as far as to use the School of the West to argue that homeschooling shouldn't exist, added Brewer, the homeschooling scholar, but I think it shows what can happen when homeschooling is unregulated. Is so unregulated, so it opens itself up to these extremist ideologies. However, strong political trends and practical constraints pose obstacles to the implementation of any reforms that might meaningfully curb the use and abuse of homeschooling as hate indoctrination pipelines. So even people who feel strongly that there should be more regulation and have recommended various changes will say, but it's hopeless, Bartholet said. So in other words, the School of the West likely won't be going away anytime soon. Think about that. So look at this picture. Let me show you here. I'm going to pan back up to it. Racism is taught. Racism is something that is learned by adults who hate and who teach racism and ideologies and traditions and indoctrinate. And so the only way you can learn to be hateful is to learn it from people who also